Every empire that ruled this earth did one thing before it fell, and that one thing was printing more money than it could ever repay in coin or in kind. Rome did it, China did it, Spain did it, France did it. And right now, something very familiar is unfolding again across the modern financial world around us. Welcome to the Market Antiquarian, where history and finance reveal how the world really works. Subscribe to stay informed. The Roman denarius coin in 200 AD contained over 80% pure silver, and merchants across the Mediterranean Sea trusted it completely in every trade. By 270 AD, that same denarius coin held less than 5% silver, and Roman soldiers across Europe were refusing to accept it as real, legitimate payment. Merchants in Rome began hiding real silver coins under stone floors, while worthless cheap coins circulated freely through the crowded Roman market streets. The Roman government had wars to fight and roads to build and armies to feed, and the only tool they had left was a melting pot and a government coin mint. Every time Rome reduced the silver in its coins, prices rose, and ordinary Roman farmers paid more for bread, while the government quietly paid out far less. Soldiers along Hadrian Wall in Britain began demanding payment in grain and food instead of denarius coins because the coins no longer carried real value. Roman merchants in Alexandria, Egypt, stopped accepting the official coin and started bartering goods directly because money had become a government trick. The Roman Senate in Rome passed laws forcing merchants to accept the debased coins, but no law could force people to believe in money that held no real worth. Prices across Roman cities rose 1,000% between 200 AD and 300 AD as more cheap coins chased fewer real goods through collapsing Roman trade routes. By 400 AD, Roman soldiers were abandoning their posts along borders in Germany and France because the government could no longer pay them in anything trustworthy. The fall of Rome is often blamed on invading armies, but historians today agree that economic collapse from debased currency broke the empire from the inside. China, under the Song Dynasty around 960 AD, gave the world its most dangerous invention, and it was not a weapon but paper printed to look like real money. Song Dynasty officials in Chengdu City created jiaozi paper notes to replace heavy iron coins that merchants could not carry icily over Chinese mountain roads. For a short time it worked perfectly, and trade expanded along Chinese rivers and through mountain passes as merchants across busy cities accepted the paper notes. Then the government began printing more notes than iron or copper existed to back them, and prices across Chinese cities started climbing without any natural stop. By 1020 AD, merchants in Shanghai and Chengdu refused jiaozi notes without applying heavy discounts because the paper supply had outrun every real backing resource. The Song government printed notes to fund military defense against nomadic armies from the north, and each new battle required yet another round of printing. Soldiers fighting on northern Chinese borders were paid in paper that local merchants would not fully accept, and military morale collapsed alongside the currency. The jiaozi note that once carried proud imperial seals was now rejected openly in Chinese markets, and the Song dynasty could no longer fund its own army with it. Kublai Khan took control of China and expanded paper money across the largest connected land empire the world had ever known, from Beijing to Persia. Marco Polo walked through Kublai Khan territory in the 1270s and described watching workers press imperial seals onto paper sheets inside official Beijing buildings. Polo recorded that the Khan created money by pressing a seal, and every merchant from China to Persia was required by law to accept it or face royal punishment. Kublai Khan used printed money to fund failed military campaigns into Japan, Vietnam, and Java, and every failed invasion required printing even more paper notes. By the late 1200s, the Mongol chao currency had flooded markets from Beijing to the Persian Gulf, and prices had risen to levels that ordinary people could not manage. Merchants across Mongol trade routes began secretly carrying gold and silver because paper money could no longer reliably purchase the goods it once easily bought. The Mongol Empire fractured not only from military pressure, but from deep economic instability that printed money had made impossible to reverse or bring under control. Spain had real silver from Bolivian mountains, and still managed to collapse its own economy, and this is one of history's most painful and instructive financial lessons. In 1545, Spanish explorers discovered Cerro Rico Mountain in what is now Bolivia, and it held one of the largest silver deposits ever found anywhere on Earth. Spanish ships loaded with Bolivian silver sailed into Seville port, and for decades, enormous quantities of silver poured into the royal Spanish treasury without pause. King Philip II sat on the most powerful throne in Europe, surrounded by stacked silver coins inside the royal palace in Madrid, believing himself untouchable. But Spain spent that silver on war after war after war, instead of investing it into factories or farms or infrastructure that could produce lasting national wealth. Silver from Bolivian mines funded Spanish armies fighting in the Netherlands, in England, in North Africa, and across Mediterranean waters for over 60 continuous years. As silver flooded into Spain without matching goods being produced, prices across Spanish cities exploded in what historians now call the price revolution of Europe. By 1600, prices in Madrid had risen 400% compared to 1500, and ordinary Spanish workers earned wages that bought less and less with every decade that passed. Spain defaulted on royal debts in 1557, then in 1575, then in 1596 as the crown kept borrowing against future silver shipments that could never arrive fast enough. The Spanish fleet that once commanded Atlantic Ocean waters began shrinking because the government could not afford to build and maintain its warships in Cadiz harbor. By 1650, the most powerful nation on earth had become a struggling kingdom, barely able to pay its own soldiers or repair the roads connecting its own Spanish cities. Silver, that should have built an enduring civilization, instead funded temporary military pride and left behind a nation buried in debt with prices that crushed ordinary life. France had a different version of this story, featuring a Scottish economist named John Law, who arrived in Paris in 1716 with an idea that changed financial history. Law convinced French leaders that paper money, backed by land and future trade, could replace gold and silver and rebuild the French economy from near total collapse. He established the Banque Generale in Paris in 1716 and issued paper notes that French citizens could use for taxes and business across the whole country. The bank worked at first, and French trade expanded rapidly as paper notes made commerce far easier than carrying heavy gold coins through cobblestone Paris streets. Law then merged his bank with the Mississippi Company, holding French territorial rights in Louisiana and along vast North American river systems far across the ocean. Shares in the Mississippi Company sold inside Paris coffeehouses, and French merchants crowded Rue Quincampoix Street every morning, desperate to purchase rising shares. Share prices climbed from 500 livres to 10,000 livres in under 2 years, and ordinary French people sold home furniture and silver jewelry to buy into the company. Law printed more money to fuel the buying frenzy, and the French money supply ballooned far beyond any real land or goods that could logically support those values. By 1720, the Mississippi Company collapsed in Paris, and French citizens clutching paper notes rushed to the Royal Bank building demanding gold coins in exchange. The Royal Bank ran out of gold within days, and crowds outside its locked doors swelled into thousands of desperate French citizens demanding their real money returned. John Law fled Paris in a private carriage at night, escaping toward Italy through Lyon, while financial panic spread across the streets of the French capital behind him. France did not learn its lesson, and 70 years later, revolutionary. France printed assignat paper notes, backed by land seized from the Catholic Church across the country. French revolutionary leaders in Paris believed land backing made assignats trustworthy and stable, and they began printing them in enormous quantities very quickly. By 1796, France had printed 45 billion livres in assignats, and prices in Paris had risen so sharply that workers needed wheelbarrows of paper notes to buy basic bread. The revolutionary government held a public ceremony in Paris where printing presses used to create assignats were ceremonially destroyed before watching crowds. It was a dramatic public moment, but the damage to French markets and to French trust in paper money was already done, and economic recovery took many years to arrive. Then came the most powerful financial empire the modern world had ever produced, rising from colonial settlements along the eastern coastline of North America. In July 1944, delegates from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to redesign the entire global monetary system. They agreed that every global currency would be tied to the United States dollar, and the dollar itself would be tied to gold at exactly $35 per ounce. Gold bars sat stacked inside Fort Knox, Kentucky, behind heavy vault doors and armed military guards, and any nation could exchange dollars for that gold directly. This made the United States dollar the most trusted currency on earth, because paper held real gold behind it, and American factories produced half of all global goods. American cars, refrigerators, and steel beams moved to rebuilding Europe and Asia after World War II, and dollars flowed back into American banks from every direction. The system worked remarkably well through the 1950s, and the United States economy grew as American factories ran at full power and dollar trust spread worldwide. The Vietnam War began draining the American treasury in ways that President Lyndon Johnson refused to cover through tax increases, choosing deficit spending instead. Military spending on Vietnam operations through the 1960s rose dramatically while expensive domestic programs expanded simultaneously inside American cities. By 1968, foreign governments wondered if Fort Knox held enough gold to back every dollar in circulation. And French President Charles de Gaulle acted on that concern. De Gaulle sent French ships to New York Harbor, loaded with dollars, and demanded physical gold in exchange because he did not trust the dollar to hold its value. Other nations followed France, and gold began leaving Fort Knox steadily as foreign governments preferred real gold bars over American paper promises. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon sat inside the Oval Office and made a decision that would permanently alter money as the entire world had known it. Nixon appeared on American television screens and announced the United States was ending dollar-to-gold convertibility, effective immediately that very night. From that August night forward, every currency on Earth became paper-backed only by government trust, and no longer by any physical gold sitting in any real vault. Nixon called it temporary on that evening broadcast, but it became the permanent foundation of the global financial system, and has remained so every day since. Within 2 years, oil prices quadrupled as OPEC nations demanded compensation in a world where dollars no longer carried the weight of real gold behind them. Inflation spread across American cities through the 1970s, and grocery store shelves in New York and Chicago showed price increases week after week without relief. Americans waited in gasoline lines across California and Texas in 1973, feeling in their daily lives what monetary instability actually looks like from the ground. The United States money supply measured approximately $600 billion in 1971 and began climbing from that year forward without any gold ceiling to limit it. By 2000, the money supply had reached $4 trillion, and the pace of expansion was accelerating in ways that would have been unthinkable under the gold standard. The financial crisis of 2008 brought American housing markets to collapse, and Wall Street banks in New York stood at the edge of institutional failure almost overnight. The Federal Reserve in Washington responded by creating new dollars electronically and purchasing trillions in troubled assets from struggling banks across America. Quantitative easing, as this process was called, added trillions to the national balance sheet, and it had no real historical precedent in scale or in speed. Then 2020 arrived, and a global health crisis pushed the United States government to print and distribute money at a pace that dwarfed everything that came before. The money supply expanded by over 40% in under 2 years, and direct payments moved from government offices into ordinary citizen bank accounts across America. Prices for houses, food, lumber, and vehicles rose sharply across American cities through 2021, and inflation returned as a daily reality for ordinary working families. The pattern that began with Roman silver shavings and Song Dynasty mulberry paper and French assignat wheelbarrows was now appearing again in a strikingly familiar form. History had already written this warning through the bones of fallen empires, and collapsed currencies, and broken promises printed on paper backed by nothing tangible. Every empire that printed its way through a crisis bought itself a little more time, but never escaped the mathematical reality waiting at the end of that road. The question now hanging over financial offices and lecture halls and kitchen tables across the world is whether the dollar is approaching that same familiar ending. The answer does not live in opinion or prediction, but in the documented historical record of what printing empires eventually faced and what came after their paper fell. History has an answer, and it is not comfortable, but every piece of evidence from every fallen empire points in the exact same well-documented direction across centuries. When Rome could no longer maintain the silver content of its coins, the government lost its ability to pay armies and border defenses in Germany, and Britain began collapsing. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine River into Roman territory, not because Rome was militarily weak on paper, but because Roman soldiers had stopped trusting their own government money. The final Western Roman Emperor Romulus Augustulus was removed from power in Ravenna, Italy, in 476 AD. And the western half of the Roman Empire ceased to exist that very day. What took centuries to build through military conquest and road engineering dissolved within decades. Once the money that held the empire together lost all credibility among citizens, China, after the Song Dynasty paper collapse, saw the Mongol chao currency fail so completely that the Yuan dynasty government in Beijing lost all public trust in printed notes. The Yuan dynasty fell in 1368 AD, and the founding emperor of the Ming dynasty in Nanjing banned paper money for nearly 200 years because the memory of collapse ran so deep. Ming dynasty merchants across Chinese trading cities returned to carrying actual silver coins through crowded market streets because no printed government promise was trusted anymore. France, after the assignat collapse of 1796, experienced such severe economic pain in Paris that Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power partly by promising to restore real monetary order. Napoleon introduced the Banque de France in Paris in 1800 and restored gold and silver backed currency as a direct response to the chaos that printed assignats had left behind. The lesson France delivered in 1800 was that after printed money fails, the path back always requires anchoring currency to something real that citizens can physically hold and verify. Every one of these recoveries involved pain. The only difference between them was whether the pain came from deliberate reform or from complete uncontrolled collapse in city streets. Germany, after World War I, provides the most dramatic and well-documented example of what happens when a major nation prints money without restraint or any fiscal discipline at all. The German government in Berlin faced enormous war reparations under the Treaty of Versailles signed in 1919 and chose to print paper marks rather than cover the debt through taxes. The German mark in 1921 traded at roughly 75 marks per United States dollar. And German workers in Berlin received weekly wages that still covered basic daily household expenses. By November 1923, the German mark had collapsed to 4.2 trillion marks per single United States dollar in the financial markets and streets of Berlin. German workers in Frankfurt and Hamburg received wages carried in wheelbarrows of paper marks, and some families burned paper currency in fireplaces because firewood cost comparatively more. Bakers in Berlin posted bread prices on chalkboards in the morning and erased them by afternoon because inflation moved faster than any printed price tag could ever follow. A single loaf of bread in Munich reached 200 billion marks by November 1923, and a postage stamp required 50 million marks in the same collapsing paper money economy. The German government issued a new currency called the Rentenmark in November 1923, backed by agricultural land, and the catastrophic hyperinflation stopped almost immediately after. But the economic and social damage from Weimar hyperinflation did not stop, and historians trace a direct line from that monetary collapse to the political instability that followed. The desperation that grew from economic suffering in German cities through the late 1920s contributed directly to the rise of authoritarian political movements across Germany. Zimbabwe in the 2000s walked the same road that Weimar Germany walked in the 1920s, and the result was nearly identical in every measurable and independently documented detail. The Zimbabwe government in Harare began printing money aggressively in the early 2000s to fund expenses after land reform disrupted food production across the country. By 2008, Zimbabwe had produced a $100 trillion banknote printed by the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe in Harare, and that single note could not purchase one loaf of bread. Zimbabwean workers in Harare and Bulawayo carried bags of paper currency to markets, and shopkeepers began weighing notes on scales rather than counting them individually. The Zimbabwe dollar was officially abandoned in 2009, and citizens began using United States dollars and South African rand for all daily transactions across every Zimbabwean city. The lesson from Zimbabwe matched the lesson from Rome, the lesson from Song Dynasty China, the lesson from Weimar Germany, and the lesson from revolutionary France almost exactly. Now we return to the United States dollar, which has sat at the center of the global financial system since 44 nations agreed in a New Hampshire hotel in July 1944. The United States national debt stood at approximately $1 trillion in 1980 when President Ronald Reagan first entered the Oval Office in Washington. By 2008, before the financial crisis hit, Wall Street, the national debt, had reached approximately $10 trillion held by governments and investors across the world. After the 2008 crisis and quantitative easing programs launched from the Federal Reserve Building in Washington, the national debt crossed $14 trillion by 2011. By the end of 2020, after pandemic spending and stimulus checks distributed from Washington, the national debt had crossed $27 trillion in fully verified government figures. By early 2023, the United States, national debt had crossed $31 trillion, and debt ceiling negotiations were unfolding again inside the Capitol building in Washington. Interest payments on the national debt ran at over $1 trillion per year by 2023, making interest the single largest category inside the entire federal government budget. When interest payments become the largest expense a government carries, that government is no longer primarily building infrastructure or funding schools from its collected revenue. That government is working to service its past spending, and every new dollar created to cover that cost reduces the purchasing value of every dollar already in circulation. The global trust in the United States dollar as the world reserve currency is not a permanent law of nature. It is a historical agreement, and agreements can be abandoned. China and Russia began settling bilateral trade in currencies other than the United States dollar through the 2010s, and those arrangements accelerated significantly after 2022. Saudi Arabia, which had sold oil exclusively in United States dollars since a Washington agreement made in 1974, began discussing yuan-denominated oil transactions directly with China. The petrodollar system, which anchored global demand for United States dollars since the 1970s, was showing documented cracks in official statements from Riyadh and Beijing. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, meeting as BRICS nations in Johannesburg in 2023, formally discussed alternative payment systems and new potential reserve currency frameworks. When the nations that produce oil and manufactured goods begin requesting payment in alternatives to dollars, the structural foundation of dollar dominance visibly begins to shift. This is not speculation. It is a documented series of diplomatic meetings and public statements made by heads of state and finance ministers on official government records. To be fair, the United States dollar holds advantages that Rome and Song Dynasty China and Weimar Germany and Zimbabwe never possessed, and those advantages deserve honest acknowledgement. The United States military remains the most powerful armed force on Earth, with naval vessels operating across Pacific and Atlantic waters and bases on every strategic continent. The Federal Reserve in Washington operates with institutional independence that the Roman government mint and the Weimar printing office and the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe never had. The United States economy, at over $25 trillion in annual output, remains the single largest national economy on Earth by a consistently significant and documented margin. American technology companies in Silicon Valley, California, led global development in artificial intelligence and digital infrastructure that billions of people and institutions depend on daily. The depth of United States Treasury bond markets in New York means investors from Tokyo to London to Dubai continue placing capital into dollar-denominated assets as their default. These structural advantages are real and significant, and they cannot be honestly dismissed in any comparison between the dollar and previous fallen reserve currency systems in history. And yet every empire in history believed its advantages were permanent until the morning it discovered those advantages had quietly eroded beneath the surface for years without notice. Roman engineers believed Roman roads and military discipline made the empire eternal, and yet soldiers along the Rhine River walls eventually walked away from their assigned posts. Spanish admirals believed the Cerro Rico Silver Mountain in Bolivia made Spain permanently dominant, and yet Spanish warships sat rotting in Cadiz harbor within a single following century. The British pound sterling was the global reserve currency before the dollar, and Britain believed its naval power made sterling dominance a permanent feature of world trade. Between 1914 and 1944, Britain funded 2 world wars largely through debt, and by the time 44 nations gathered in New Hampshire, the United States dollar had replaced the British pound. The British pound did not vanish. It simply stepped down from global dominance, and British citizens experienced a long gradual decline in purchasing power through the 20th century. The question historians now ask about the dollar is not whether it disappears, but whether it is beginning the same gradual step down that the British pound began after 1914. Inflation is the mechanism through which printed money silently transfers wealth, and this transfer is invisible to most people because it moves gradually and without any announcement. When the United States money supply expanded dramatically between 2020 and 2022, the purchasing power of every existing dollar was quietly diluted without any public vote or debate. A family in Ohio holding $50,000 in a bank account did not lose any numbered dollars, but those $50,000 purchased measurably less in grocery stores and housing by 2022. This is the same mechanism Rome used when it shaved silver from denarius coins, and the same mechanism the Song Dynasty used when it printed more jiaozi notes than goods could back. The method changes from silver shavings to mulberry paper to electronic keystrokes at the Federal Reserve, but the mathematical outcome for ordinary savers stays historically identical. Historians who study monetary collapses have identified specific documented warning signs that consistently appeared before each major currency failure in the verified historical record. The first warning sign is when government interest payments begin, consuming a large and growing share of national revenue rather than being directed toward productive public investment. The second warning sign is when foreign central banks begin diversifying reserves away from the dominant currency, toward physical gold or alternative international monetary assets. Central banks worldwide purchased a record volume of physical gold in 2022 and 2023. According to World Gold Council data published from their offices in London for public review, the third warning sign historians document is when the reserve currency nation runs persistent trade deficits, funded by money creation rather than by producing and exporting real goods. The fourth warning sign is political gridlock around fiscal decisions, where governments cannot agree on spending limits and debt ceiling talks become recurring and predictable annual events. The fifth warning sign is when ordinary citizens seek inflation-resistant stores of value outside the official currency as a practical hedge against the visible erosion of purchasing power. These 5 warning signs are not predictions about the dollar. They are documented historical markers drawn from academic study of monetary collapses across multiple fallen civilizations. We began this documentary with one observation. Every empire that ruled this earth did one thing before it fell, and that thing was printing more money than it could ever repay. Rome shaved silver. China printed on mulberry bark. Spain spent silver faster than it arrived. France printed assignats. Germany printed marks. Zimbabwe printed trillions of worthless notes. Each government believed its situation was unique. Each believed its advantages were sufficient to escape the pattern that had consumed every empire before it in recorded history. None of them were correct, and the ruins of Roman forums and abandoned Weimar printing presses and worthless notes displayed in Zimbabwe museums are the enduring permanent evidence. The dollar is the most powerful currency the world has ever produced, and it carries real structural advantages that no previous reserve currency in human history possessed together. And history does not care about advantages. History cares only about decisions. The decisions that determine monetary outcomes today are the same fundamental ones that Rome once faced. The choice is whether a government produces more than it borrows or borrows more than it produces, and history has documented with remarkable consistency which path leads where. Every person in a city today, whether in New York or London or Lagos or Mumbai, is living inside a monetary system built entirely on trust and sustained by ongoing daily decisions. The gold bars at Fort Knox, Kentucky still sit behind vault doors and armed military guards, but they no longer anchor the dollar to any fixed rate tied to any physical reality. The dollar today is backed by faith in American institutions, and faith is powerful. It built the Bretton Woods system in New Hampshire in 1944 and sustained dollar dominance for decades. But faith has one documented historical weakness, and every monetary historian who has studied this field has named it clearly. That weakness is memory. When enough people across enough nations remember what unrestrained printed money eventually does to purchasing power, the trust begins shifting, and that shift builds its own momentum. When trust shifts in monetary systems, history shows it tends to move faster than any government or any central bank in any city can contain or slow or reverse through standard policy. The most important question in monetary history is never simply what happened. It is always what will the people who come after us say about the decisions being made right now. Rome made its decisions in the minting halls of ancient cities, and we read about those decisions in history books today. Someone in the future will read about the decisions made now. That future reader will examine the debt charts and the money supply graphs and the diplomatic meetings held in Johannesburg and Riyadh and recognize a very familiar historical pattern. And the only thing separating that pattern from a different outcome is the quality of the decisions made by the governments and institutions in the years that still lie ahead of us. The past still has stories to tell. Subscribe and let us uncover them together.